I'm Jessica Denson, host of Lights On with Jessica Denson. As millions and millions of people flood the streets of this country, peacefully protesting the illegal administration of Donald Trump and his attempted authoritarian takedown of American democracy, a mere spattering shows up for his birthday military parade, just underscoring the amount of support that really exists in opposition to him and the lack of support for Trump and his administration. It kind of makes us go back to questions about the 2024 election that very few of us had the courage to dig deeper into. Donald Trump sweeping 7 swing states on election night. So many admissions from Elon Musk and Trump himself that he didn't need votes. Strange, seemingly unexplainable statistical patterns of drop-off rates where Donald Trump got many, many more votes than the down ballot candidates, or Kamala Harris way underperforming the down ballot candidates in the cases where she was not selected in states and districts and precincts. There have been a lot of recent revelations in this space, including an election smart legislation election lawsuit that is moving forward in Rockland County, where some of these very strange anomalies have occurred. It is hopefully this case proceeding towards discovery. Their ultimate ask is that there is a hand recount in Rockland County, where very strange anomalies occurred, including in some districts, Kamala Harris receiving 0 votes. There have been other recent reports about voting machines not having adequate testing. That has been a topic that we have covered in detail on this show with election security experts. One of them is going to join me today to go over some of these recent developments, including a recent article she wrote in Slate about Donald Trump's call for Tina Peters, the Colorado woman who was criminally convicted of trying to tamper with voting machines, calling for her to be released. So it's my great pleasure to welcome back to Lights On Susan Greenhalgh, the election security expert from Free Speech for People. Susan, welcome back to Lights On.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So I was reading back through your article for Slate, and you talk about Donald Trump calling for Tina Peters to be released. He, of course, pardoned over 1,500 some very violent, including people who committed seditious conspiracy, insurrectionists from January 6th. Here he is calling for someone else who was involved in the efforts that you are intimately familiar with in trying to compromise voting machines. Can you just bring us up to speed, refresh our memories on what happened in the case of Tina Peters?
Sure. Tina Peters was the county clerk for Mesa County, Colorado, which is a county in western Colorado. She, after the 2020 election, she was one of the people who was trying to prove fraud on behalf of Donald Trump. And she, a jury found her guilty of breaking several laws to allow people associated with a bigger network of election deniers working on behalf of Donald Trump to overturn the election, to access the equipment, to make copies of the voting system software taken from Mesa County. And then later it ended up on a website where anyone could access it and download it. And also it was highlighted at the cyber symposium hosted by the MyPillow guy, Mike Lindell, in August of 2021. Her involvement in accessing the software happened around the spring of 2021. She subsequently was charged for her involvement in allowing this unlawful access to the voting equipment. She wasn't actually charged with taking the software, but she was charged with like identity theft to allow the guy that went in to take the software, found guilty and charged with and sentenced to 9 years in prison. And this is in state court in Colorado, so Donald Trump cannot pardon her, but he has called for her to be released. And he has also, or subsequently, the Justice Department, the U.S. Justice Department has sought an unprecedented amount of election records from Colorado. And the Secretary of State has suggested that getting these records was part of is part of the Justice Department and the Trump administration's effort to try to get Tina Peters free.
It's very alarming, Susan. And what you underscore in this piece that you wrote in Slate is how this was a multi-state effort. It was not just Georgia. It was not just Colorado. There were attempted breaches in Michigan, in Pennsylvania. These were all financed by Sidney Powell. And the records that you have poured into in court documents indicate that many of the same people that were involved in all of these plots, and that copies of the software were shared across state lines, suggesting, as you write, a broad, coordinated, multi-state effort that could implicate federal crimes. And then you go on to explain how this could have compromised the 2024 election. Can you just talk a little bit about that? I mean, it's really unthinkable, Susan, that we are at this point and we have not investigated or mitigated that potential harm, and we are past the consequences of what it possibly caused in this country.
I think that's a very good way to put it. This is the largest election security breach that we know occurred in the United States. It has been profoundly and woefully underreported in the press, even though it has gotten some coverage, but not anywhere near what it deserves. As you mentioned, there were breaches in Georgia, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, in Colorado, and software that was provided under subpoena legally in Arizona was unlawfully shared beyond what it was supposed to be, so that many of the same people got it. We have evidence, direct evidence, that shows that Sidney Powell paid for the breaches in Michigan, Georgia, and Pennsylvania as part of her work to overturn the 2020 election. And then we can also then start to draw those yarn diagram types of connections between the people that received the copies of the software, the people that were involved in other breaches, like the one in Colorado, the people that were involved in that got the copies of the software in Arizona, that they're all interconnected. So this was a coordinated scheme between these different breaches. And the scary thing is that they got the software. We don't know what's happened to it, because there never was any federal investigation, unfortunately, under the Garland Justice Department. We can't expect one now for sure. So we don't know what they've done with the software. And having the software could enable bad actors to develop ways to attack the system. And you don't have to listen to me when I tell you that, but I will say that when Dominion thought that their software was going to be released in Arizona under subpoena, they fought it very vigorously, and they said that it would do irreparable damage to the national security interests of the country if their software was given to partisan actors, which it ended up in the exact same hands that they were fighting. The Attorney General in Georgia did not want to hand the software over to Sidney Powell before she went in and took it. And in court, he argued that if we gave her the software, it would be giving her the keys to the software kingdom of the voting equipment. So you don't have to take my word for it. You don't have to talk to the computer scientists that I've talked to, like Professor Rich DeMillo of Georgia Tech, who also wrote a different op-ed with me for Slate. He was a co-author on that. But people can use the software to develop ways to attack the system, and then to exploit those vulnerabilities that they've uncovered with minimal access, without having to have a lot of time and access to the machines.
Yeah, it's kind of extraordinary. In addition to your article, there's been some more recent theorizing. I'll call it theorizing, and I really definitely want to get your input on this, on how a potential manipulation or hack could have taken place. And now you and I have had extensive conversations. We've debunked a lot of things as far as the notion that these machines are not connected to the internet. We've talked about how it would not be impossible for something to be physically implanted like a USB device, and how generally in these settings prior to elections, these machines are not nearly as secured as you would hope that they would be. There's some popular Substack that's going around that is talking about this company ProVNV, which is one of two federally accredited testing labs that between March and September of 2024 signed off on a series of hardware and software updates to the ES&S voting machines. Now, kind of ES&S and Dominion are, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, the two most widely used machines in this country for elections. I think ES&S is in over 40% of the country. And what this Substack says is these updates were waved through under the label de minimis, a technicality supposedly meant for small, insignificant tweaks, while in fact, they believe that major changes were being made to these ES&S voting systems, and that this sign-off should have never happened, and possibly that's where the manipulation or compromise took place. Can I just get your thoughts? I know you've seen this Substack that's going around on this theory.
So it's a theory. It's not evidence. So I would want to make the differentiation. And I think it's more, to me, it speaks to demonstrating the weakness and the ineffectiveness of the federal testing testing program. We've known for a while about these de minimis changes. We've actually, Free Speech for People, have spoken out against some of them in the past. Yeah, we shouldn't be able to wave through these types of changes. Just to be clear, ProVNV examines the change, and then the vendor submits it and says, this is de minimis. ProVNV says, yes, we agree with you. And then it has to go to the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, and then they have to bless it and say, yes, we agree with both the lab and the vendor. I have not analyzed all the de minimis changes that they're alleging could have been exploited to have some larger impact. So I can't speak to that. But what I will say is that overall, first of all, there's a limit to how much testing and certification can actually guarantee as your voting system, because once the systems get fielded, they can be then altered in some way, even if it's not a certified system, something that's certified under the de minimis process. There's also, and hopefully you want to keep them safe, but the idea that we're keeping these systems under like very secure lock and key doesn't really hold up to scrutiny when you see how some of the systems are stored, especially during early voting and in advance of an election, when they may be sent out to sit in a library for weeks on end. So this one theory, I think, is more, it's a theory, but there are broader holes and weaknesses in the overall process that I think you could probably come up with other theories as well without looking at this one specifically, if that makes sense to you.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. This one particular kind of points to Leonard Leo and a company called Triplate, the sale of that. I mean, it's really attaching some motivations to some of the other actors that we know to operate in, heavily influential roles in right-wing politics, which is absolutely a possibility, as is the, group of conspirators that were involved in trying to overturn the 2020 election. All of these people, including Donald Trump, who was a multi-venue indicted, convicted felon who had every incentive in the world to stay out of jail, all kinds of motivations for different actors to act in manipulating this election if they had the technical capacity to do that. So, I want to ask you in a minute just about the Rockland County lawsuit and what's going on there. But before we do that, I just kind of want to play devil's advocate for a minute. I see these conversations come up. As you know, Susan, I left the network that I was on after the election to have these conversations fearlessly. But even to this day, I see some of the pushback from those in the Democratic space saying, this is not possible. They still believe that elections, there's too much scrutiny on elections for a breach to happen. I think in one chat that I was looking through, I saw people saying, look, I became an election judge for this very reason, because I wanted to see firsthand behind the scenes if things like this were possible, if manipulation was possible. And there's just too many checks that go on, on an election, at an election precinct level for something like this to be carried through it. Can you explain if and how this could happen under the radar with people who are on the ground during elections, not seeing the compromise take place before their eyes?
Well, the thing is, once you start counting ballots by computer through a scanner and then tabulated through an election management server, which does the aggregation, you're trusting the totals that come out of the computer. And unless you go back and hand count the paper ballots to make sure that they've been counted correctly after the election, you're not going to know that they're counted correctly. You are then just having to put your faith in these computerized machines that we know have vulnerabilities, that they've been well documented, and that can be compromised in different ways. So that's why we always advocate for very, very strong, rigorous post-election audits. But what I think, I'm going to hypothesize that person that posted that in the chat probably is talking about seeing pre-election logic and accuracy testing, where you'll have a stack of 100 ballots and 60 of them will be marked for Donald Trump and 40 of them will be marked for Kamala Harris. You know that in advance, and it goes through the ballot. You know exactly how many votes are marked for each person. You put it through the scanner, and the scanner should come up with exactly those numbers. And that's a great test for making sure that your machine's programmed right. But that is not a test that protects against malware or any sort of malicious attack, because any attacker worth their salt would design their malicious software to not be active in pre-election testing, to not be active before the date of the election. All computers have calendars and dates on them. They can know what time and date it is. So, and people may be familiar with the Volkswagen diesel scandal, where the Volkswagen diesel cars had software in them that allowed them to cheat in emissions testing when they were being tested at the garage. And then when you drove on the highway, they would pollute, at will. So, so this is not some sort of far-fetched idea that computer scientists have brought out. It's something that's been seen in practice. We know that it's a way that attackers would attack a system. So unless you're a computer scientist and you're familiar with some of those things, you probably wouldn't know that and would see that this type of logic and accuracy testing and say, well, of course, these machines can't possibly be miscounting. We saw them all count correctly before the election. We want to make sure they're counting properly after the election too. And that means strong audits. And unfortunately, most states don't really have strong audits. They don't look at a lot of ballots. They don't look at the ballots before the election's certified. They don't provide transparency for how they perform their audits and how the ballots are counted. I've just actually been involved in doing a review of the audits after the 2024 election and found some real gaping shortcomings in some of these post-election audits, which we can talk about another time. But you might hear people say, well, we know that the elections were audited after. Well, were they really? Like, for example, in Pennsylvania, they do one statewide race that they audited, and they did the state treasurer's race. So yeah, they did a statewide audit, but they did not do the president's contest, and they did not do the Senate contest, which was also a close race.
So Susan, you're talking about audits, and I think this is the pet peeve of any of us who have committed ourselves to the election hygiene that is necessary for any healthy democracy. You have to have rigorous audits, and the fact is, like you said, we simply don't have them. And so that is one reason why I think an organization like Smart Elections, and through their litigation arm, Smart Litigation, has pursued hand recounts. A lot of these election integrity operations are simply trying to get hand recounts. Smart Elections, for their part, brought a lawsuit in Rockland County. As stated in their complaint, according to their press release, more voters have sworn they voted for independent U.S. Senate candidate Diane Sara than the Rockland County Board of Elections counted and certified, directly contradicting those results. Additionally, the presidential election results exhibit numerous statistical anomalies. The anomalies in the presidential race include multiple districts where hundreds of voters chose the Democratic candidate Kirsten Gillibrand for Senate, but where zero voters selected the Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris. And then they talk about the Republican drop-off, which is 23%, Trump basically having way outperformed his down-ballot counterpart, where Kamala Harris is -9, has a -9 drop-off rate, and a highly unusual phenomenon where she vastly underperformed the Democratic Senate candidate. So this lawsuit currently has been greenlit into the evidence gathering stage. I believe they have a hearing coming up in September on discovery. And hopefully that is one step closer to getting what they're asking for, which is a hand recount of the ballots there in Rockland County. But can you just give me your thoughts? I know you've been following this case too, on what's going on there.
Well, I think that the miscounts are extremely troubling. And it also is concerning that when Rockland County was presented with this information, that they could see that there were so many voters who signed affidavits saying that they voted for a specific candidate, and then the machines did not count those votes. I would have liked to have seen the Rockland County Board of Election want to investigate that themselves. Why would they not seek to do the recount so they could understand what happened and start doing their own investigation? And, you know, as you know, we at Free Speech for People, with a number of computer scientists after the election, because we were talking about the unprecedented compromise of the election system software before the 2024 election, as well as the lack of really robust audits and timely audits after the election, had called on Kamala Harris to initiate hand recounts in the states that was possible. Unfortunately, of course, she never pursued that. But the whole point of having a paper ballot
I'll remind our viewers that Susan was my first guest in mid-November 2024 when I left Midas Touch to have this conversation. And I said there can be nothing possibly more important than having this conversation demanding recounts right now. And I did my own independent show with Susan, pleading with that, you know, highlighting that letter with Susan and half a dozen other highly respected election security experts in this space, pleading with the Harris campaign to do the recounts that over half of Democrats in this country were begging her to do. So it would just to zoom. I'm sorry to do this, you know, aside, but to zoom out and with what we're living through right now, these assaults, there could have been nothing more important in that moment. And hopefully we can learn some lessons that we can't pass opportunities that only exist for us in a finite space of time. We have to seize on them. So, you know, thank you for the work that your organization, Free Speech for People, your colleagues did in that moment when it was so critical. I wish more people had the courage to pay attention to you.
Well, thank you. And as we said, the whole point of having a paper ballot, when you hear people talk about election security and they tout the security of elections, they say, well, we have paper ballots. That paper ballot is only good if you look at it. Otherwise, you're just trusting the computers. And so that's why looking at the paper ballot is so vital. And so it will be really interesting to see if Smart Elections gets their recount and what that recount shows.
Yeah, it will be. And I just to play devil's advocate, because I want to address the arguments that are out there. Once again, I saw somebody say, you know what, actually in a county like Rockland, there's this, if you're familiar with Rockland County, you know, there's a very strong, heavy Hasidic community. And the way that these voting blocks often vote is how their rabbi tells them to. And Congress people and, you know, people running for office will go and they will not talk to the voters writ large. They will just talk to the rabbis, and then the voters will follow their rabbis. And so I saw a TikTok video out there that was saying, look, this isn't strange. People vote in blocks. You may have 0 votes for Kamala Harris. I shared this with you, and I wanted you to share what your reaction to that possible explanation or excuse for these anomalies was.
So I think sometimes, first of all, if that's the case, then let's just look at the paper ballots. There's a very easy answer to this, is to go back and hand count the paper ballots like this lawsuit seeks to do. And like I said, why wouldn't the county just do it on their own without having to be sued? Would make things a lot easier for everybody. But we've seen this type of explanations occur previously, and I point to an example of an election for a primary in a city council in DeKalb County, Georgia, where there was a candidate who, on the eve of the election, had made some comments that were deemed to be insensitive, and she ended up losing her election. And even though she was the expected winner, she was the incumbent, they thought she was going to take it in a walk, and instead she lost. So she went around and started looking at the results and found in her own precinct, where she knew that she voted for herself and her husband had voted for her, she had gotten no votes. And she demanded a recount and found that she actually won. But up until that point, people had said, well, it was because she made this somewhat insensitive comment, and that's why she lost all her support on the eve of the election. So I think it's very easy to sometimes backfill the explanation, and none of that is a substitute for going back and just counting the paper ballots to see how the voters actually made their choices. Because the whole point is, let's have the will of the voters and examine that and know that that's actually how our elections are being determined, by the will of the voters.
Absolutely, Susan. And maybe just as we wrap up, you can give us your final thought. There's so much sentiment out there that I think in the Democratic establishment space of wait for the midterms, just wait till we get back power in the midterms and we'll do all these things that you're wanting us to do now instead of taking action now. My viewers here on Lights On know I have no patience for that position. But when you hear people say, just wait for the midterms, are you confident, Susan, that our elections in the upcoming 2026 midterms will be secure?
I'm deeply concerned about this. I think we have to really be clear-eyed about the state of our election security. And that includes, and people are very much concerned about Trump trying to interfere with state elections, but they continue to turn a blind eye to the fact that his supporters went out and willfully and unlawfully accessed and kept copies of the voting system software, and we still have no idea where that's all gone and how that actually can impact the elections. We cannot afford, we're on the precipice of a dictatorship, as you highlighted. And if we want to hold on to our democracy, we need to be honest with ourselves about what its shortcomings are. And the fact that our voting equipment is so dependent on compromised computers or computers that have had their software compromised is something that we can't keep putting our heads in the sand about.
Absolutely. Now is the time to get your head out of the sand. If it ever was the time, now for God's sakes, it's the time. Yeah. Susan Greenhalgh, Free Speech for People, as always, a pleasure. Thank you, my friend, for joining me again today on Lights On.
Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. My pleasure. And you can support the work that Free Speech for People does at freespeechforpeople.org. They are also the ones that have the petition running that has gotten over 500,000 signatures to impeach Donald Trump. That's at impeachtrumpagain.org, impeachtrumpagain.org. If you haven't signed that petition already, definitely go and do that. If you want to support me and my work here on Lights On, you can do that at thejessicadenson.com or thejessicadenson.com/donate. Thank you, as always, for being with us. And as always, let your light shine.